Using money in an attempt to end poverty is like using a border in one's attempt to end xenophobia. Immigration. It's one of the most fluidly controversial topics of conversation in our politics, our education, and our law enforcement here in the United States, specifically concerning our geographic border with our southern neighbors, Mexico. Of course, the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans patrol our coasts, and our northern neighbors have never given us pause. But for a multitude of reasons, our relations regarding Mexico typically surrounds the 1,989-foot-long strip of land that is apparently a hotbed of criminal transactions and illegal human movement. It's not the first border to be hotly contested among pundits, nor will it be the last. However, we have completely disregarded the pages of history and determined that a wall of concrete and barbed wire will prevent inconveniences in the future. This is one wall out of hundreds throughout time immemorial which will not work, for the simple fact is, walls don't work. If you don't believe me, we're going to take a chronological trip throughout history to illustrate that walls that go up must come down. The most impressive wall that history has ever wrought was built in the Qin dynasty of China at the height of its power. If you're unsure about which wall I'm talking about, just go to Google Earth. You can see this wall from space. That's right, it's the Great Wall of China. Revered as one of the 7 wonders of the world, the Great Wall of China is a feat of human engineering. It was built without the modern conveniences of cranes, bulldozers, and land movers. The Qin dynasty in general was expansive, stretching from eastern China all the way to the Indian provinces to the west. However, China had a barbarian problem to the north. Ironically, these barbarians were often hired by Qin dynasty's administration to help them control their expanding territories and keep them in check. In fact, these barbarians were largely responsible for China's expansion during that period. As history would have it, the barbarians grew too numerous and the Qin dynasty too poor to afford their services, and that's when the tables turned. China decided to focus its efforts on stemming the barbarian invasion. You would think that diplomacy would cost less in terms of material, effort, and lives lost than building a 5,500-foot stone wall complete with barracks and stairs, but I'm sure it seemed like a good idea at the time. Ultimately, when the Qin dynasty fell to economic woes, the wall's construction halted just as it passed China's midline. According to UNESCO, which is the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, the Great Wall of China is a national symbol of China's exertion of power and control over its citizens. What is less advertised is that the migrations of these barbarians belittled the wall, for eventually they assimilated and integrated themselves into Chinese history and culture, fading into the faces. But let's be real, the Great Wall of China is ancient history. Literally. There's no way it could set a precedence for anything that we're experiencing now in 2015, could it? Then let us fast forward to the year 1961. It's the year that Disney put out 101 Dalmatians, or that Audrey Hepburn won the award for Best Actress in her portrayal of Holly Golightly in Breakfast at Tiffany's. This was the year that the Berlin Wall was built. Born out of the stubbornness of the ruling factions in Germany after the fall of the Nazi government from World War I, the Eastern Berlin government built the wall to separate themselves, as well as hundreds of thousands of citizens that they lumped in with them from the fascist Westerns. This was an attempt to preserve their socialist state. The wall was additionally accompanied by a blockade of goods, food, and aid. In a mad dash, people tried to flee from Eastern Berlin to Western Berlin before the wall was built. 30,000 people did not make it, and many died in the crossing because at the time, shooting illegal immigrants was the only way to stem defection from Eastern Berlin. The United States President at the time, Mr. Kennedy, hailed the wall, going on record that the wall served to diffuse tensions between the ruling factions. However, as time went on, the tension became palpable as the Eastern Berliners began to suffer under what was essentially their imprisonment. After years of politics, the wall did indeed come down in 1989. This was an unprecedented reunion, unlike anything the world had seen. Whole families and neighborhoods were scarred by a wall running straight through them, separating them for over 60 years. Not only were they reunited, but so was the whole of Germany. It is to our benefit to see that the only result of the Berlin Wall being in place was suffering. Had politics persisted and dialogue pursued, the wall may never have been necessary. But we can't erase history, we can only learn from it. Our last stop on this journey takes us to the Middle East. Rich in history, you would think that border disputes would have been settled by now and have been a thing of the past. However, as early as 1994, the government of the People of Israel began to construct a so-called defensive measure against mounting violence against its people from the oppressed Palestinians. Like it or not, Palestinians have been ousted from their homes, largely due to United States involvement in resettling hundreds of thousands of Jewish refugees after the end of World War I. Side by side, the Jews lived among the Palestinians with no fuss. However, a small group of powerful Jewish leaders embarked on an unlawful mission called Zionism to seize Palestinian territory and authority and establish a Jewish state. They presumed that the world would not miss Palestine. Of course, many of their holy sites are located in Palestinian territories, so they could justify their movements. Of course, this did not sit well with Palestinian Authority, but they were summarily crushed under the U.S.-financed uprising of Zionism, and the Palestinians suddenly found themselves the victims of an occupation. This is just the struggle in a nutshell, and the wall is the proposed solution by Zionist Israelis to keep Palestinians in their place. Much like the Berlin Wall, whole neighborhoods are separated by this wall, and a blockade of food, water, and goods and medical aid has been enforced. Commutes are significantly prolonged, access systematically denied, and tensions understandably high. The wall has been documented by the American branch of Al Jazeera, a Middle Eastern CNN. They estimate that 1.8 million Palestinians live in 139 square miles enclosed by this wall. Unlike the Berlin Wall, the Israeli-Palestinian wall still stands, and is fortified regularly. While the injustices of the confines of a cage are obvious, this large and encompassing wall can give onlookers the false sense of freedom for the people of Palestine. And we can only hope that similar to walls throughout history, that this one will also fall. As it stands, it breeds resentment and xenophobia, a fear of the other. Could you imagine a situation so desperate that it was necessary to put up a wall to enforce supremacy? It's been my understanding, as well as the conclusion of many historians, that walls do not work. Michael Deere of the Huffington Post devoted himself to a three-year-long intensive study of the efficacy of the wall dividing Mexico and the United States, and his findings can be read in his books, Why Walls Don't Work. He concluded that the border is and will always be semi-permeable to those who are desperate enough economically rather than criminally. While illegal immigrants are still pouring in, many of them children and pregnant women, politicians sit blissfully on decisions that would help reform immigration proceedings so that these most vulnerable people can enter the U.S. legally and safely. But unfortunately, it's just not good politics. The border is seen as a piece in a game of political chess that is played every 4 years to stir debate and presumably differentiate candidates. And while many candidates use the topic of conversation to make wild claims, such as the ability to pull off building an impermeable border complete with the deportation of millions of illegal immigrants, does little more than to blow off hot air and further stigmatize people willing to make a perilous journey for a better life. That's not to say, however, that we can completely disregard legitimate security concerns. That's why special task forces, economic aid, and good old-fashioned diplomacy on the part of the federal government would be a far more reasonable and achievable option. Immigrants do not just uproot their entire lives for no good reason. They're obviously seeking something greater here in the US. And if we as Americans are afraid of the unemployment ramifications, then perhaps we should start placing back on their pedestal the blue-collar jobs here in the United States instead of peddling them off to cheap and mostly illegal labor. As time will show, all walls fall, and it would be a waste of resources and energy to put a physical barrier to a social issue.